So in this video, I want to talk about the biochem part of anatomy, so the chemical parts associated with life. And so first, we have to define an element. And an element is the simplest form of matter to have unique chemical properties. And so just look at the periodic table. Each one of those is an element. And so let's say you have carbon. So carbon's atomic number is 6. And so that is also 6 is also the number of protons in its nucleus. And so all of these elements are arranged by 1 to 2 letter symbols. And so there are 24 elements that have a biological role in the body. And so 6 elements actually account for 98.5% of your body's mass. So the 6 elements are oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, calcium, phosphorus, and nitrogen. They account for 98.5% of the mass in your body. And so, of the 24 important elements, all are minerals. So, all are minerals except all are minerals except oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And these minerals provide a wide variety of functions. For example, calcium right here is 3/4 of the mineral mass in your body. Mineral mass. And, calcium and phosphorus added together, because they contribute to bones and stuff. And other minerals function as electrolytes, which are needed for nerve and muscle functions. And so let's talk more about the chemistry or the structure of an atom. And so an atom has a nucleus, which is a center. So that's in black. It's actually made up of protons and neutrons. So we'll use red as protons, and then green as neutrons. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so this, for example, would be carbon. And then on the outside, there's essentially a cloud of electrons. So these electrons are always moving. And the electrons actually determine electrons, E minus, determine chemical properties of an element, of an atom. And so that makes sense, because the electrons are the ones that actually come into contact with other atoms. And so if you have the same number of electrons and same number of protons, oh, I forgot to mention, protons are positively charged, protons positive, neutrons no charge, and electrons are negatively charged. And so if you have an unequal number of protons and electrons, you have ions. So ions are unequal number of protons and electrons. And so there are two types of ions. There are anions, which have one less. So I'll draw it like this. Yellow for electrons, and let's say we'll use carbon again, but this time carbon has lost or gained an electron. So red is a neutron. Let's say we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 electrons. And so that would make this cation because it's positively charged. And so what that means is it just lost an electron. And so if you have the same number of protons in carbon, and then for example carbon gained an electron on the other end, that would be called an anion. So anion gained electrons, and it also has a negative charge. A good way to remember this is cats have paws. So cation, positive. And so an anion and a cation, since they're differently charged, one is positive, one is negative, they're attracted to each other. And so let's pretend there's a little bond there. And so that type of bond is actually called an ionic bond. And so there's another bond called a covalent bond, and so that's where you see something like this, where the electrons are shared. And so there's actually two types of covalent bonds. There's polar and nonpolar. If you ever learn more about chemistry, you'll understand more about this, but it's essentially how electronegative an atom is. So how much a good way to think of it is how much the electrons are shared, like if it's shared equally. So if one atom, for example this carbon here, it wouldn't do that, but I'm just giving an example. For example, if that one pulled electrons a lot more, then it would be nonpolar because electrons are not shared evenly. I mean, it would be polar because electrons are not shared evenly. Nonpolar, electrons are shared evenly. And so this bond here would actually be nonpolar. And so there's also a thing called a hydrogen bond. It's not a legitimate bond. Hydrogen bond. This is actually really important in biology and anatomy. So a hydrogen bond is essentially an attraction between an oxygen and F, fluorine, nitrogen, or oxygen, and a positive slightly positive hydrogen. And so what that means is if you have a water molecule, this oxygen pulls electrons more towards it. So we mark that as a delta negative. And so it's hogging all of the electrons, so the hydrogens here are more positive. Slightly. It's not a true positive charge. And so what happens is this water molecule is attracted to other water molecules. The negative oxygen, that's not a real bond, it's just like an attraction, an intermolecular force. And so the negative is attracted to the positive once again. And here we have positive, negative, positive. And the element that's in place of oxygen could be fluorine, nitrogen, or oxygen. That would all be considered a hydrogen bond.